This module is an introduction into the drinking water regulations, and I like to start off the regulatory discussion by reading an excerpt from the National Geographic Disease Detectives, published in 1991. In London, England, it was said that a man walking in good health could be dead by sundown. Within 250 yards of the intersection of Cambridge and Broad Streets, more than 500 people died in little more than a week. Carts groaned under the weight of corpses carried away for mass burial. No one knew the cause. Some blamed foul vapors. Others saw the work of divine retribution. Those who could fled. Others locked themselves away in fear. But a 41-year-old physician named John Snow believed he had found the source of the contagion and set out to prove it. Snow plotted the location of the victims on a street map. Nearly all had lived near the Broad Street pump, one of the many public water pumps in London. But before Snow could be sure, he had to understand why 10 deaths had occurred nearer another street pump. Amid the growing panic, Snow visited the families of the deceased. 5 of the distant victims, he learned, regularly sent for the water from the Broad Street pump, preferring its taste. 3 others were children who attended a school near the Broad Street pump. That was all he needed. Snow appeared before the vestry of the St. James Parish, meeting in solemn consultation on the causes of the epidemic. His request astonished them. He asked that the handle on the Broad Street pump be removed. It was. Within days, the outbreak of cholera ended. I like to start off with that little excerpt because to me that is kind of the beginning of a very simple but effective regulation on water intended to protect public health. Nowadays our regulations are much more complicated. It's a book that's probably about 2 inches thick, and unfortunately we as operators don't need to memorize all of that. But we do need to know some certain critical aspects of the regulations, not only to be a good operator, but also to do well on the regulatory portion of the examination. So this module is going to highlight those key components of the regulations that you should become familiar with. The first thing is to just give you a little historical background on how we've gotten to be where we're at in terms of regulations. This slide gives you a little of the perspective historically. The big one on this slide is in 1974, the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, which set into motion the establishment of all the drinking water standards that we have to date. Periodically, the Safe Drinking Water Act is amended and additional contaminants are added to the list. In 1986, there were significant amendments which increased the number of contaminants from 26 to 83. I think now we're up to somewhere over 100 contaminants. A lot of the contaminants are broken down into what EPA calls individual rules, and this is just a list of some of those that we're going to cover in this course. Some of them I'll present briefly in this module, and others we'll cover later on when we get to the different components of the treatment plant where the particular regulation would apply. So a few terms before we get into any of the specifics of the regulation is this term MCL, which means maximum contaminant level, and MCLG, which means maximum contaminant level goal. Contaminants that have a maximum contaminant level, or MCL, have been shown to be of a health concern, and we're going to talk about some of those. There are some contaminants where ideally we would like to have a goal where we could reduce that contaminant level to a much lower level, but the ability to do that with the current technology does not exist. So In those cases, we establish a maximum contaminant level goal. A couple of other terms that are important are acute and chronic. Acute means that there's a contaminant. The contaminant that is in the water could cause fairly quick and significantly serious health effects. And there's not a lot of things on the acute list of contaminants. There's only a handful, and we'll go through some of those. Most of the contaminants that we deal with in drinking water fall into the other category, which is known as chronic. Chronic just means that if you drink the water that has an elevated level of that contaminant, you run the higher risk of developing some kind of a health problem. It could be a nervous system problem, it could be cancerous, something like that. So acute and chronic, understanding the difference between those two is important. In some cases, we cannot easily measure a contaminant. Either the method of measuring is very complicated, or it may not be very reliable, in which case EPA has come up with this term treatment technique, which means that if we can demonstrate adequate treatment through some other kind of measurement, then that satisfies the concern of whether that contaminant is still in the water. The other term that we use in conjunction with maximum contaminant level is this thing called action level, where if it's a certain level is exceeded, it's not a violation. It simply means that the public water system must take some action to reduce the risk. And the best example of that is lead and copper. There's not an MCL or maximum contaminant level for lead and copper. There is an action level, and we'll talk about that. And you probably have heard on the news exceedances of the lead action level in most famously Flint, Michigan. This slide lists out some of the more important contaminants. These are the ones that tend to show up on the exam over and over again. And like I said, there's over 100 contaminants now that are regulated, and we don't have to memorize all of them, but we do have to be familiar with some of them because we deal with them more as an operator, but also because they are the questions that show up on the exam.